Hey, I'm Craig. This is part 3 of the series on Darwin's Voyage, and we're finally up to the voyage. And as I said, most of the 5 years of the voyage is in South America: Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, Chile, and Peru. And Darwin is, for a total of 3 of the 5 years, off the ship exploring land. The ship returns home then the long way, brief stops on a series of islands: Tahiti, New Zealand, Australia, Mauritius, South Africa, and St. Helena, having gone all the way around the world. Now, the first stop is not South America, but prior to crossing the Atlantic to get to South America, they stop at a tiny archipelago at the Cape Verde Islands off the coast of Africa to restock provisions. And while there on Santiago, the main observation that struck Darwin at the time, consistent with his newfound interest, was geological. He did notice and collect biological specimens. For instance, he was delighted by an octopus that changed colors, and that he found when he brought it back to the ship it glowed in the dark. And such discoveries were especially exciting for Darwin because in his inexperience, he assumed what he was observing was new not just to him, but to science. But the geological observations that he made in Santiago actually do turn out to be newish, not the mere observations of them. They were available for everyone to see. It's the side of a cliff, but in terms of Darwin's interpretation of it. Now, this cliff is lava rock, all black, with a horizontal white stripe running through it for miles. And the white stripe is made out of shells and corals, so presumably it was underwater at some point for this calcareous matter to be lifted, baked, and bleached by the sun. And when Darwin was viewing it, it was 50 feet out of the water. Now, it seems like, and this was Darwin's interpretation of it, that the seafloor must have risen, some kind of subterranean upthrust, bringing what once had been seafloor up out of the sea. And this is a theme that we'll revisit several times during his voyage, the idea of land rising and sinking, elevation and subsidence, producing observed geological formations. And further, since the stripe was almost slower in some places, but almost completely straight, the motion causing that elevation presumably would have to be pretty uniform, lifted all together, and maybe very gradual. And Darwin had just been reading a recently published first volume of a work, Principles of Geology, by Charles Lyell, promoting a view of geology variously described by the terms uniformitarianism and gradualism, which viewed the Earth's surface as the result of tiny cumulative changes taking place over enormous spans of time. Necessarily enormous spans of time, because each of these changes were so tiny. And this was all in contrast to the dominant school of geology at the time, typically referred to as catastrophism. And as the name implies, the changes were neither uniform nor gradual, nor necessarily requiring spans of time. And typically they viewed water as the primary vehicle, floods of their catastrophes. Whereas for uniformitarianism, gradualism, the Earth's current geology was primarily caused by heat from below. So we'll revisit this on the west side of South America when Darwin witnesses several geological phenomena there. He sees a volcano erupting, visits several dormant volcanoes, and experiences a major earthquake. But first now, actually making it to South America after several weeks crossing the Atlantic, Darwin was able to stay for a few months on land in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Sees monkeys, anthills twice his height, shimmering iridescent hummingbirds. Here's a quote: "If the eye attempts to follow the flight of a gaudy butterfly, it is arrested by some strange tree or fruit. If watching an insect, one forgets it and the stranger flower it is crawling over. If turning to admire the splendor of the scenery, the individual character of the foreground fixes the attention." And he describes his mind at this time as a chaos of delight. However, in stark contrast to the awe of Brazil's natural wonders, he was also struck by the horror of Brazil's man-made institutions. Slavery was still rife in the country. I think it would last until the 1880s, one of the last countries, and permeated all interactions. So, for instance, Darwin was shocked when a black man flinched, expecting to be hit by him when he was just trying to ask for directions. And later, he was incensed by visiting a plantation where the owner was threatening to sell some of the slaves as punishment, and recognizes that the threat of being permanently separated from one's spouse, children, family, friends is a means of oppression, probably way, way worse than any kind of physical beating. And at all times, this is hanging over their heads. Now, it's possible that Darwin had even some tiny impact in motivating people in Britain and Europe against slavery. His travel memoir was a bestseller, and he relays several of rather gruesome incidents near the beginning of his book in chapter 2. But whatever the historical influence of his experiences, they get Darwin thinking about differences between people. He doesn't find that there's such a difference. He also finds there's a big moral difference between the people owning the slaves and the people that are the slaves. And also thinking about the role that culture plays in normalizing certain behavior, such that it's no longer considered as an open question. Something that would come up repeatedly as he meets very different people at each of his stops. Now, scientifically speaking, one of the most significant events during the voyage occurs next, further south, Bahia Blanca, Argentina, specifically Palo Alto. Darwin discovers a cache of fossil bones, and he spends the better part of a day digging, then returns for 2 subsequent days with help of some of the ship's crew. And amid the fragments, partial skeletons, there is one nearly complete skeleton, and Darwin thinks what he finds at the time might be as many as 6 different creatures. And as for the complete skeleton, he quickly identifies it as a sloth. Although giant sloths were the only South American fossil, I think, well, I suppose mammoth as well, that had been identified at the time. So it's a pretty natural guess, absent obvious evidence to the contrary. Oh, sloth. And he also found part of what would have been a huge shell, a piece that had been incorrectly previously identified as also belonging to Megatherium. Oh, this is giant sloth. But again, that was the only thing known. Darwin correctly says, no, I think this is, looks like it belongs to what would be a giant armadillo. And this is later what would come to be known as a glyptodon. So he's noticing there's this kind of continuity of type of, well, there's all these mid-range size animals currently living extant in South America, and what I'm finding extinct, now it's recent past, he doesn't know how to date these, but Ice Age, and they're just like bigger versions of what is currently alive. He also bought a fossilized skull from a rancher. It had been propped up on a fence post, and a local mentioned it to him, so he jumps on his horse to go see if he could purchase it. And again, it's like a big version of a guanaco, or animals that are currently living there in South America. And for any real analysis, he's going to have to wait until specialists in England clean up these bones and compare them to anything similar from actual physical comparisons or from their previous knowledge. But just from eyeballing these things, it looks like there's a good example of continuity through time of type. And finally, one of the more peculiar parts of our story, the ship sailed to what is sometimes called the end of the world, the southern tip of South America. And I think the people there were the southernmost people in the world. And they're going to return 3 natives that they have on board the ship back to their homeland after having been invited/kidnapped by the captain on his previous outing. And he had brought them back to England. And they'd been in England for a couple of years. The British Navy had been rather non-committal when the captain had mentioned he was bringing natives back with him. It wasn't terribly uncommon that these would almost be, you could say, circus attractions. That's not what the captain did or what his intent ever was. His plan was to have them educated, civilized, and most importantly, from his perspective, Christianized. And he paid for all this himself. And then the idea is, well, I'm going to bring them back to the tip of South America, knowing some English and the Bible with a missionary, and then we can set up a mission and spread this to people in the region. And none of this was initially premeditated by him, it doesn't seem, when he first invited/kidnapped them. And the best thing that can be said in the captain's defense is that they made no effort to leave during that critical period where maybe there could have been an alternative if they'd wanted to. They seemed very content, but there's no way they could have known where they're going, or, oh, we're going across the Atlantic. They don't have a sense of. And initially, he just had a little girl. That's the most obvious case for calling it kidnapping. She was grabbed as a hostage along with a group of others, kids and adults. The adults, none of which were tied up because they figured they wouldn't leave the kids. They did. The adults all escaped. So now he's got a bunch of kids. And the reason he took them as hostages is that the natives in the region had stolen one of their smaller ships. These are serving or charting voyages, so they're going up and down the coast, and the large boat can't go too close into shallow water, so they have all these additional smaller boats on the big boat to go affect that. Also, these are lifeboats if they need their life in the case of the ship capsizing. So he kind of needs his boat back for multiple reasons and thinks that, well, the natives will trade if I capture a bunch of them and hold them hostage, and they weren't interested at all. They really liked this boat. And so puts the kids back on shore. This little girl just seems so happy on his boat. This is his telling of it anyway. And so he starts thinking, hey, I will bring her back to England and Christianize her. And at that point, he really just starts inviting people on the ship, young people, not for anything weird. I mean, I guess it's really weird, but not that kind of weird. And he gets 4 of them eventually. One of them dies of smallpox or a smallpox vaccination, and now bringing them back to their homeland. Now, he had some integrity about all of this, in that he was going to pay for it himself to have them brought back. Relative at the last minute pulled some strings, who's a naval captain, got a commission to, okay, yeah, you can drop them off as long as you're also surveying the coast of South America, as your primary mission. So that's what we're on our way to do now.